Hey there! In this brief lecture, we're going to talk about Q waves and what they mean. So, in other words, what's the definition and at what point should you be concerned if you see a Q wave? Because not all of them are bad. And you won't always necessarily see one in the QRS complex, yet we will continue to call it the QRS complex even if there isn't a Q wave. So what does that mean? Well, when you think about a Q wave and the actual definition of it, it should always be the initial deflection of a QRS that's negative. If that very first deflection is not negative, you do not have a Q wave. So let's take a look at a P wave followed by QRS complex. Normally what you would see is a little hump, please excuse my bad drawing, and then initially sometimes you might see a little drop down before the huge spike up with the R wave. So with the QRS, sometimes you might see a small Q wave, but not always. So another example would be where it just goes straight up after the P wave and you don't have that small dip. That's perfectly normal, and actually that's how it should be in most leads. So when you look at the chest leads, notice that in V1 there is no Q wave, nor is there one in V2, V3, or V4, or V5 even. Not until they get to V6 do you see a very subtle Q wave, which is that first dip down in the QRS complex. For some people, you might start seeing one in V4 or V3. So again, just because they do have one in those chest leads is not a bad thing. In the limb leads, again, you may or may not always see a Q wave. Oftentimes in lead 2 you probably will, and even lead 1, but in this example there's not one present. Not until we get to AVR and AVL, where that is very, very typically going to be seen, especially AVR, where we know everything is reversed. So when you look at the full 12 lead ECG, again, remember, sometimes you might see a small dip in lead 1 and even lead 2. Sometimes maybe lead 3, but for the most part, not everyone will have one. V1, V2, and so on. Again, some people may have a very subtle drop, but typically it's not until you get into V4 through V5 and V6 where you should see some small Q wave. So now, what if it's considered abnormal? When is it abnormal? Well, typically whenever we see an abnormal Q wave is when it's getting more than 0.04 seconds down. So if you count the number of small boxes, we go beyond 2, it's probably an abnormal Q wave. So typically what we look for are those really dramatic spikes going down in the QRS complex. Sometimes it might be a little bit more subtle, and you have to look a little bit harder and see if there is one, and then determine if it's significant or not.